Get ready to enter a brave new world with your host, Vasant Dhar.
We've taken centuries to build trustable institutions that handle our money and property. We've got banks, central banks, watchdogs, lawyers, and a large number of intermediaries to make it all work. That's all about to change. We're in the early stages of a brave new world of finance, much of which will be run by machines that execute contracts automatically and often anonymously. In this world, machines become our trusted institutions. Trust is achieved via consensus among a number of entities that verify each transaction, where the incentive for each party contributing to the consensus is to be truthful. The question is, how is all this going to work? For starters, how will taxation work if the government has no idea what's being transacted in the virtual world? Will we still need banks? Or will we all just have our accounts with the central bank instead of Citibank or Wells Fargo? Will each unit of digital currency become 100% trackable? How will such a world coexist with an internet that's decentralized and anonymous? I'm going to talk about all this and more with my guest, David Yermack, who is chairman of the finance department at the Stern School at NYU. David is a colleague who saw quite early that the future of finance would be driven by tech, fintech, and crypto, and he's been immersed in this world for almost a decade. It's always fun to get his take on the current state of finance. David, welcome to Brave New World. I'm delighted to have you on the show.
Thank you, Vasant.
I can't believe it's been 5 years since you and I designed the Intro to FinTech course along with our colleagues Yanis Bakos and Kathleen DeRose. And much water has flown down the Ganga since then, as they say in India.
Things are moving very quickly. Bitcoin itself just had its 13th anniversary just a couple months ago. So the technology that we're focusing on is itself brand new. I started teaching a course on cryptocurrency, which was then almost entirely a Bitcoin course 7 years ago in 2014.
I remember that. Yeah.
We launched the Foundations course 5 years ago. These courses are very heavily enrolled. In fact, there's still a lot of unmet student demand. We're offering multiple sections, and there's a weekend section for the executive programs, and we're now going to have an evening section for the part-time MBA. But I think as quickly as we can get knowledgeable faculty, we'll continue to build out this curriculum. And it's been very exciting for the school to be a leader in this area. It definitely created a nice halo effect and helped attract better candidates in the admissions office, better recruiters to hire the students, and so forth.
It's interesting. We are not afraid to experiment and make decisions. In fact, I don't know if you know this, but David Shom, one of the leaders of the crypto movement, was at Stern before it became Stern. He was in the information systems department.
I didn't know that. Yeah, because he did the paper he wrote back in 1982, I think was a PhD dissertation at Cal Berkeley.
Right.
And then he taught here?
He came here. Yeah,
No
he was
kidding.
here. Yeah,
Wow.
he actually left the year I joined. And
I'll have to bring this up in class. That's nice to know.
Yeah, we have a rich heritage in this space and also in the machine learning space. I started teaching the machine learning course here at Stern in '94. So we have been indeed not afraid to experiment.
Yeah, I think it's one of the nice parts about NYU is they encourage you to cross boundaries, to do interdisciplinary work. In fact, I think at the dean's level, they're even accountable for this, that they have to report back to the center about how are you working with other faculties, what projects and initiatives are going on. And I think it's a great part of the university and very different than some other schools that I've been around.
Yeah, indeed. I have fond memories of interacting with, Roy Smith and Ingo and a whole bunch of finance faculty, in the 90s, when technology was transforming finance, but not in the way that we're seeing now. It's been a fun ride being here, indeed. So let's get into the subject of the day, which is finance and things like blockchain and DeFi and all these cool things that are appearing on the landscape. Over the last 100 years, we've had constant improvement in the financial system, where we've created trustable institutions, require more transparency, we've crafted laws around conflict of interest, investor protection, KYC, all this kind of stuff, to the point that the U.S. has the most trusted financial system in the world. Are we at the beginning of a transformation where all this is going to change radically?
I think the answer to this question is surely yes, but I would maybe not even agree with the premise. If you say that the U.S. has the most trusted, I might rephrase that as the least untrusted regulatory system. But there's a very long history, and really until early in the 20th century, finance was regulated purely through reputation. You know, you had private banks creating money that would trade maybe at or below parity based on the integrity of the bank. You had disclosure on a strictly voluntary basis. Companies could either get audited or choose not to. And the decisions that different companies made sent very strong signals about how honest they were, how much their customers could rely on them. And all of this begins to change after the Depression, where the government takes responsibility for this and begins creating one federal agency after another. First the SEC, and soon afterwards FDIC, and there's now CFTC. There's a whole alphabet soup, the U.S. very complicated regulatory scheme. But on their watch, there have been so many debacles. You know, the global financial crisis 11 years ago is just one of many times. You know, you can talk about Madoff. You can talk about all kinds of scandals through the years where the regulatory apparatus just didn't meet the needs of the customers to head off these problems. And there's a long academic argument in finance about whether the old way wasn't better, where regulation was done on a voluntary basis at the firm level. And basically, every company made their own choices about what to disclose, whether to carry insurance, whether to list their shares on different exchanges. But again, the decisions that they made were extremely transparent and sent powerful signals to investors who could differentiate high-quality from low-quality securities probably better than in a regime where everyone discloses all the same stuff. It was also a much cheaper system. The cost of regulation has gone sky high. Especially after Sarbanes-Oxley came in 2003, there became a chorus of people saying that there was simply too much compliance cost. And you've seen the number of public companies shrink in the U.S. from about 10,000, which was the high watermark around the year 2000. Today, there's somewhere between 6,000 and 7,000. And some of these firms have gone abroad. Many more have just decided to stay private, to operate really in the old 19th century system of private capital raising, private accountability based on reputation, without subjecting themselves to what they see as a very costly and inflexible and ultimately pretty ineffective regulatory regime. So I'm not sure that regulation will survive the onslaught of decentralized blockchains. I don't think that the structure of these new markets fits at all with the structure of the regulators and what they're used to in terms of being able to go to a node or a bank or a clearinghouse and delegate to that central focal point the job of collecting data, of flagging irregular behavior by customers, withholding taxes, and so forth. All this is going to have to be done in the future on some type of peer-to-peer basis, if it's done at all. And I don't think the government is prepared in the least to deal with this. It's really way out of its comfort zone. And I think the regulators will probably, at the very least, take a totally different form 10 years from now if they're still out there. And that remains to be seen.
You've raised a bunch of issues there, the sort of concentration of a smaller number of really large players. It's really become hard to do business as a small player. The costs of regulation are onerous. To what extent is this new movement a generational one? And I ask this because when I talk to people my age, or maybe 10, 20 years younger, the typical reaction is, I don't get it. What is this? Whereas whenever I'm with anyone under 30 and they know that I'm in finance and systematic investing, the first question I get is, so what do you think about crypto?
Yeah, which coin should I buy?
Exactly.
No, I talk about it with my kids all the time. I was horrified that 2 of my 4 kids own crypto because this is nothing I would recommend really to anybody given how risky it is. And One was my son, who is a university student, and the government sent him a stimulus check in the pandemic, and he just put it into Bitcoin like many other people. And he said, "Dad, everyone trades the cryptos at school." And the other was my teenage daughter, who just a few days ago was admitted to Johns Hopkins for next year. But she was mining crypto for fun like 4 years ago when she was 13. And she didn't really make that much money, but it showed both the accessibility of the technology to even, a curious 13-year-old teenager in New Jersey you could kind of hook in, and definitely the generational aspect that the kids today lead their life on the smartphone. And there are payment systems and, things like Discord and, media channels that the parents have not even heard of, but the kids are very used to exchanging information in a very different way. They didn't grow up reading newspapers and opening the mail the way that romance is conducted among today's youth, or the way that they apply for jobs, or, all of that is so different. And the people who have put the blockchain systems out there, I think, have harnessed a lot of that energy. But it's not that older people can't understand this. And I think, frankly, you're going to need to. If you work in any industry where data is important, the new paradigm of a decentralized platform where nobody really owns or controls the data, I think, is quickly going to migrate into things like shipping and logistics, healthcare, certainly vital statistics at the government level. There's just all kinds of applications where this technology is going to become indispensable, and people will be forced to learn to use it, but they'll be better off.
Coming back to this sort of generational thing, I think, it almost feels to me that we've been talking about how this generation has less mobility than their parents' generation, and they feel disempowered. It almost seems to me like that this is an empowering thing, right? So that they own this new way of doing things, and this new way is better, it's uncensorable, you can't stop it. It's almost like this is like a new form of the hippie movement.
They're networked in a way that we never imagined when we were kids. My daughter can whip out her mobile phone and tell me where a friend is eating lunch halfway across the country in real time, and then maybe send that person a text message about don't order this. And the way that the velocity of information and the level of detail at which they're informed about one another's activities is very interesting. To an extent, they've all agreed to have no privacy in this world. Everyone seems to know everything about everybody else, and it doesn't bother them. But if you can kind of get past that, there's a richness of the experience that is, it creates a lot of energy and a lot of vitality in people's lifestyle.
Many years ago, maybe 6-7 years ago, our colleague Scott Galloway and I created this digital marketing course. And I was appalled that people really didn't care about privacy at all. It just wasn't, don't you care about privacy? And they'd sort of roll their eyes and say, no, I got nothing to hide. And I'd say, you do, you just don't know it. But it's just a different mindset.
It is. It's interesting as well to go around the world. I've, as an academic, gotten a lot of invitations. It's a nice part of the job that you can get called to conferences and seminars and to meet with governments, wherever there's interest in the topic. But you certainly see some nations engaging with this technology much more quickly than others. I would say Singapore probably stands out, Hong Kong, Korea, many of the Pacific Rim countries, Australia, I would add. But even within Europe, you see huge differences. Sweden has given up cash, and this happened spontaneously. Just people at the very basic retail level didn't want to use it anymore, and they just stopped, to the point that you can't even find an ATM in Stockholm anymore. And Sweden's an older population. It's not really a country run by teenagers. I've taught in Germany and in the Netherlands many times, and these are very similar economies that share a long border. There's, almost hard to imagine two countries more alike economically, but their attitude toward financial services is completely different. The Dutch are extremely forward. They've got these blockchain campuses and can't hear enough about this. There's a street in The Hague called Bitcoin Boulevard, which is a tourist destination for crypto people. The Germans are still using paper cash. They don't trust banks. The companies won't go public. They're using the financial system of 500 years ago, and I think that will continue to be true for a long, long time. But the culture of a country plays a big role, I think, in the diffusion of this technology. And you can point to places like Britain, Estonia, now El Salvador, where there's real enthusiasm and a willingness to experiment. And I think this will pay big dividends for them downstream, that they will become market centers, they will attract entire industries organizing around the consumer demand. And it's going to rearrange a lot of value in the financial world for sure. Some of the ancient capitals of finance may not be so important in the next 100 years if they don't begin to embrace fintech the way that some others are.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah. No, I was in Sweden over the summer. I never saw a banknote while I was there.
Yeah.
There's this story about, a thief who broke into a bank and he was arrested because they didn't have any cash.
No, the joke is if you take kroner into a bank in Stockholm, they'll tell you, we don't take that here. You can't even deposit physical currency in the bank. It's got to be electronic or they don't want to talk to you. I had spent a sabbatical, I think, in 2005 in Stockholm, and I've been back every few years. But on my most recent trip, I brought some old kroner, and I couldn't spend it anywhere. They said, "What are you, a tourist?" I said, "Yeah, in fact, that's why I'm here." And they said, "Yeah, you had to exchange all this. You had until a couple of years ago, but now it's just a collector's item." And it's very interesting, though, because I think the Swedish experience takes age out of the equation because this is really an older society. Mm-hmm. But they all have very quickly adopted this platform they call Swish, which is sort of networks all the banks in a mobile payment system that resembles Venmo. I think now India has launched something very similar to the Swish platform where there's coordination, where the government definitely plays a role in making sure that everyone's using the same technology and settling accounts. They found a way to stay relevant, I suppose. But it wouldn't surprise me if India begins to look a lot like Sweden, where there's an interbank network that drives the physical rupee, almost out of the circulation. Yeah. There's lots of interesting stuff happening in India, and I'll come to this later in our conversation. It's a slightly different approach where the government is playing, the demonetization. Well, that was a bit of a fiasco, but they've sort of created some interesting platforms. Beginning with the identification and now the payments. Yeah, the Aadhaar platform is very interesting. Right. There's a lot of innovation that I think ultimately best practices will move around the world and be widely adopted. But you're at the early stages where some countries are taking a lot of risks, and India is certainly among them. And it's fun to teach this stuff. There's a lot of imagination that is being. Yeah. What's really interesting is the role or the extent to which governments are stepping in into this space. So in India, the government's kind of stepped in and created these platforms because they felt they initially had to provide access. There were 600 million people without an identity. So they've sort of worked ground up. But the other countries where it's, governments are playing sort of a relatively passive role and not really stepping in. One great example is Kenya, where they let an affiliate of Vodafone come in about 13 years ago. It even predates Bitcoin, but they have a payment service called M-Pesa that was intended to serve unbanked people who it's a country where there are great distances between villages, so they rely very much on a courier system for money transmission. So Safaricom, which is the name of the company, created essentially a payment system run on the basis of transferring cell phone minutes from one member of the network to another. And it pretty quickly reached the point that more than 50% of the GDP in the country moves across the M-Pesa system, which is a private alternative really meant to usurp the role of the government. And I met a gentleman years ago from Kenya, and we were talking about M-Pesa. And I said, when it gets this big, it really makes Vodafone into the central bank for the country. Mm-hmm. And he said, yes, that's exactly the point, that we trust Vodafone more than we trust the real central bank. And I think it's a classic case of a private provider taking over a function that the government wasn't doing well enough to meet the needs of the population. And I do think you're going to see more of this. These were some of the thoughts we were exchanging at the very beginning of the interview. I think the government has, in many countries, gotten too involved and put straitjackets upon these industries and held back innovation and growth. In most societies, government will probably be withdrawing and stepping back, even if it doesn't wish to, because it simply doesn't understand or can't compete with the benefits of the technology.
Yeah, in fact, a lot of the evangelists have come from countries with unstable governments. They've been sort of the catalyst behind this movement. Russia, Argentina, just places where institutions aren't trustworthy, money depreciates faster than you can earn it. A lot of this has been driven by people who just didn't have any faith in institutions and intermediaries and governments.
No, the launch of Bitcoin was in early 2009, which was at the very bottom of the global financial crisis. And a lot of people have pointed to this coincidence, saying that crypto might never have been taken up by people if it hadn't first appeared at a point where the banking system around the world had fallen into the greatest disrepute. But as I've taught this, I've taken a long view of this, and I've found that the first bank runs occurred in Roman times. And the solution of the Roman government was government deposit insurance funded by taxes on the bank. It's exactly the same system. It hasn't been improved in 2,000 years. And we still get the bank runs, even in countries like the UK and so forth. And there are problems that look very timeless. And the solution of Satoshi Nakamoto is not to try to make the banks and the middlemen behave better, but to design them out of the system altogether. To have banking without banks. Yeah. And I think it was Bill Gates who said that there will always be banking, but there won't always be banks. That the world needs banking, but it doesn't necessarily need banks.
Yeah.
And I think
by the way,
put.
Since you mentioned Satoshi Nakamoto, what's your best guess? Do you think it's Hal Finney?
That's become kind of trendy right now to think it might have been Finney. I've always thought that Nick Szabo is the best suspect just because of the similarity between the Bitcoin white paper and Szabo's manifesto about smart contracts that dates from 1997. I just remember personally being struck as I read one, and then at a different time I read the other. I said, this is the same vocabulary, the same sentence structure, the same agenda. One is about trustless contracting, the other is about trustless payments. And then I read that language filters had been brought into this and that they had concluded on their own the same thing that I had, that these have very high similarity scores. So I think more likely than not, it's a group of people. That Satoshi, probably not one individual, but maybe 3 or 4, a small working group. But I wouldn't be the least bit surprised if Szabo wasn't part of that. And it could be Szabo and Finney were both involved. It's it's interesting to conjecture about these things. And of course, we've had this litigation down in Florida that just ended a week or two ago where Craig Wright, the Australian, was on trial for allegedly defrauding his collaborator, Dave Kleiman, who many people point to Dave Kleiman, who was a cryptographer from Florida, as maybe the best suspect for Satoshi. And Kleiman died of Lou Gehrig's disease. No, he had the MRSA virus, I'm sorry. And Kleiman died just about the time that Satoshi disappeared, as did Hal Finney, of course, who died, of... He's the one with Lou Gehrig's disease, but they both died young and before their time. And for that reason, they can't really refute or speak for themselves in this argument. And there have been other suspects from time to time. But I think sooner or later we'll probably get a more definitive answer. But that trial in Florida certainly settled nothing. It only raised even more questions about people's credibility and the fate of that 1.1 million tranche of Bitcoin, whether it's in this tulip trust or whether those coins are lost and frozen forever. It's an interesting question.
Let's get into sort of the meat of crypto and DeFi and this whole move towards decentralization, and some people call it Web 3.0. Well, actually, I was going to ask you why are regulators paralyzed? But before we get into that, let's just kind of lay the groundwork here. What is DeFi?
DeFi is where someone puts a piece of software out there that can be used by two counterparties to do a simple financial transaction, to make a loan, to trade one asset for another, to put something in escrow and borrow against it subject to restrictive covenants, whatever the software provides for. It's really the whole menu of transactions that you would currently go to a bank or maybe a stockbroker to do, things like margin lending. And it's decentralized because there's nobody who mediates this in the middle. There's no brokerage house that sets a capital requirement. It's all by code. The middleman is a computer program, and the two counterparties don't even know the identity of one another. So it's decentralized simply because nobody's in charge of it, and because it's a computer program, it really can't even be stopped once it's launched. There's no way to shut it down other than unplugging the whole internet and so forth.
Sort of what's the combination of the technology and incentives that makes it all work?
I think, frankly, a big part of this is what we call regulatory arbitrage. That if I'm an investor and I sell a token at a profit, I owe capital gains tax. And if I'm on a platform that looks like a traditional market maker, let's say like Coinbase, they have some legal obligation to report you to the Internal Revenue Service, and you'll probably end up having that tax withheld, or you'll pay it on Form 1040 or whatever. On a DeFi platform, nobody knows who you are, and there's no middleman to identify you as someone who might owe tax. So I think a lot of people are going to these platforms just to get out from under basic regulation. The regulation about income tax, money laundering, probably bad things like drugs, human trafficking, even terrorist financing is being trafficked on these platforms in some way, shape, or form. So I think a big appeal is the anonymity and the much lower cost, because you don't have to pay the fees for compliance, and you don't have to pay the tax man and so forth. But I think these platforms go beyond that in that they're available 24/7. You can only trade on the New York Stock Exchange 30 hours a week, and you can trade 168 hours a week on a liquidity pool. And there are no barriers to entry, in that anybody who wants to open a liquidity pool for a pair of tokens can do so. And they don't have to get clearance from the SEC. They don't have to meet the listing requirements of the New York Stock Exchange. And a market where there's free entry and exit with no compliance and no taxes has obvious appeal to a large number of people who, don't like the burdens of regulation that you run into. There are trade-offs, though. These platforms, for sure, are vulnerable to manipulation. You don't have a lot of transparency into the information or the motives of the people you may be trading with. So things like insider trading and so forth could be, very, very risky in a way that it's probably not in the equity markets. Not that the legacy markets are free of problems, but I think you have at least more confidence that you're trading with an honest counterparty who has met their own obligations to register and pay taxes and so forth. And for some people, that is very reassuring. But there's a whole different clientele of people who are not terribly concerned about this, who are, have their own agendas. They want to minimize taxes. They want to stay private from governments. They want the flexibility to trade quickly when they want. And DeFi offers all of that. It can be, a really potent mix for a lot of people.
At the beginning of our conversation, you were talking about regulation, and it's been a mixed blessing. But I guess one of the good things about it was sort of investor protection, that a lot of people don't really understand what they're getting into. And by the way, this applies to the crypto world as well, right? I mean, the crypto world is sort of the evangelists, the tech geeks, and people who really kind of understand it, and everyone else who think they do, sorry.
The rate of financial literacy has never been terribly high, even within this building, I'm afraid. and in the world at large, it's deplorably low. We definitely have people who rely on the institutions of government and the regulations in place to relieve them of the burdens from having to understand what they're investing in. I can just go to Vanguard and say my target retirement date is 2035, and they'll take it from there. They'll rebalance my portfolio. They'll do all my taxes and paperwork. And And I don't have to think about any of this.
Right. Or even before that, they're not going to walk off with your money.
Yeah.
Right?
And they're bonded in a classical sense.
Right.
That the government requires them to meet capital levels and undergo audits and inspect, and I rely on all that as a customer, and it relieves me from having to do the research myself. But there is definitely a segment of the market that is capable of doing this for themselves, that doesn't need to be part of some type of nanny state, where you sit down and people explain that you'll need to save for retirement and that compound interest is very valuable. There are some people who get that already and are more than willing to bypass a lot of the paternalistic protections that you get from government. But still another crowd is definitely the people who invest for entertainment, who are chasing volatility, who do it as a form of sport, really. And in the pandemic, when all the sports were closed, I think a lot of the meme finance stepped in and filled this void. But you worry about these folks, and I think probably some hard lessons will be learned, but many university students, have bookies and bet on sports, and this is just part of coming of age. I think today this has kind of migrated into the financial markets, but it's a problem that didn't begin with crypto, and whether it's even a problem, I think, is a fair thing to have an interesting debate about.
Yeah, I guess people haven't gotten badly hurt yet. That hasn't really happened in the crypto world yet.
Yeah, I'm sure, with some effort, one could find someone who bought a coin that they shouldn't have bought or had an account on a platform that got hacked. They're the customers of Mt. Gox who are still trying to get their money back, 7 years later and so forth. But because it's gone up so rapidly, there's a lot of people who've gotten rich from crypto and a lot of entrepreneurs who have, become extraordinarily successful at very young ages. You have a lot of crypto billionaires walking around New York right now, and some of them even come in as guest speakers to class. And they're just people in jeans who had a clever idea and were able to scale it up with this technology very quickly, who made the effort to understand the technology and saw its potential. And this is very interesting. It used to be to get that rich like J.P. Morgan or Carnegie or Rockefeller, it would really take a lifetime. By the time you're 80 and you'd been doing this for 50 years, you might stand at the top of the mountain. You can climb that mountain today by the time you're 26. And these are now the people who are donating to nonprofits and sponsoring political movements. It's a real interesting dynamic to see so much of the wealth in the hands of young entrepreneurs who are using a technology that most people barely understand. And I think some of the Trump pitchfork crowd is rebelling against this. There's almost surely more inequality in the world because of this technology, and that's probably not a good thing, but I don't think it can be reversed either.
So where does this leave governments, regulators, central bankers? So let's start with regulators. What are they trying to wrap their heads around here?
The basic problem is that regulators are really used to co-opting institutions like banks and clearinghouses to do all the work for them. They'll put out a set of disclosure and tax requirements and then delegate to industry the monitoring and compliance burden. So banks have to file suspicious activity reports. And anytime you spend more than $10,000 in cash, that triggers another form. And there's all these things that government essentially gets for free from industry because there are these focal points that all the financial traffic goes through. Those points either don't exist anymore or they're not manned by people. They're just manned by computer programs that no one takes responsibility for. So regulators cannot rely on that approach of bringing in a small number of nodes from industry and saying you're going to regulate this, you're going to monitor your customers and make sure everybody's honest. So I don't think government is ever going to scale up to the point that they can track every individual customer. And I think ultimately they're going to have to use probabilistic methods, forensics and big data strategies to try to filter out patterns of movements that would maybe lead then to further investigations. But the type of uniform compliance where every trade triggers a tax report and the system that we're used to that just blankets you with paper and all of it ends up in the computers of the IRS, that's going to be gone. In fact, it's already disappearing. And government is going to have to really up its game in terms of the skills it has and think in a totally different way about how to regulate or even if to regulate things. This won't make people the least bit comfortable. And you had hearings just a week ago in the U.S. Congress where 5 crypto CEOs were being interviewed by Maxine Waters, and I think they're coming back to the Senate next week for Sherrod Brown's committee, or maybe they've been there already. But the politicians just have no idea what these firms do and how you might even think about regulating them. And they're still at the soundbite stage.
Yeah, I mean, they're still trying to wrap their head around the Web 2.0 companies.
Yeah,
right?
and there's this working group on stablecoins run out of the U.S. Treasury that said we think all stablecoins should be regulated the same way that banks are regulated. Good luck with that. Tether, the USD coin, the DAI stablecoin that's issued on the MakerDAO platform, those things are never going to take the form of banks, and they're never going to generate the data that banks get from their customers. So you can say these things in Washington or in Basel, but that doesn't mean they're ever going to happen, and they're not.
Financial systems traditionally have been designed with failures and errors in mind, right? That things go wrong, you need to be able to fix them, you need time to fix them, you need recourse, you need appeals. Is this world of blockchain and DeFi able to accommodate stuff like that, or is it based on, no errors? Like, how do we deal with errors in this world?
I think it really depends on what we call the wisdom of the crowd. That, if you look at one of the central achievements of Bitcoin is something called the Byzantine generals problem, which is how the network is able to take conflicting signals where probably some people are misreporting for self-serving reasons, but is able to tell the truth using collective action mechanisms that use incentives to get people, at least a majority of people, to report correctly what has actually happened on the network. And I think these are the kinds of strategies that will create financial stability in the future, when you can have essentially reward mechanisms that co-opt the individual agents on the network to watch one another and to push out into the open the bad behavior. There's a very interesting project at Ethereum right now. Ethereum is switching, hopefully, from proof of work to proof of stake. This has now been delayed for the umpteenth time, but may happen in May of 2022. But they're splitting the Ethereum blockchain into 64 what they call shards, which are like subdivisions. And then each shard will be policed by a committee of 32 validators who are reelected roughly every 6 minutes based on good behavior. And they get bounties for reporting on anyone in the committee who isn't doing their job properly. And so
bounties in the sense of more coins?
More coins, yeah. They get to share some of the mining rewards if they flag bad behavior. And the people who behave badly get put into the penalty box for like 100 hours or something like that. So there's a whole system of decentralized enforcement that is based on some pretty fine-tuned incentive structures that I don't know if this will work or not work, but this is what they're going for, is essentially outsourcing this to the wisdom of the crowd. Making it in everybody's self-interest to be a white hat rather than a black hat. And at a very basic level, this is what Satoshi achieved with Bitcoin. It's really remarkable how stable Bitcoin has been and how you haven't had disagreements about blocks and you haven't had forgeries and frauds of Bitcoin precisely because the incentives are so well calibrated. I think what Ether is trying to do is much, much more complicated, and this is probably why it's been delayed so many times. But looking into the future, I think all the platforms will need to be thinking the way that Vitalik Buterin, the head of the Ethereum Foundation, is looking at his baby, that you're going to need to use decentralized incentives, essentially game theory, to keep these things in equilibrium. But I don't doubt that a well-designed, we call this mechanism design in economics, that a well-designed mechanism is probably more stable than the deposit insurance that we now use in the banking system that, has with some regularity led to meltdowns in, the 1980s with savings and loan crisis and the 2000s with global financial crisis in the 1930s, 1870s. Every 30 to 40 years, the financial system fails in this country. And, maybe if we try something radically new, it might be much more stable. I think, in fact, it probably will be. That's why I'm teaching it.
So let's talk about Ethereum and sort of bugs and errors that I was referring to, right? So Ethereum went through its own, I guess, crisis, that major fork, when they got hacked and that recursive call that was emptying the money, right? And they operated also by consensus, but sort of human consensus, right, at that time, and made a decision to give people their money back. And the alternative was to, just continue.
It's a crazy situation, and I think every blockchain course for the rest of time will use this as a teachable event. So what happened, and this goes back to 2015, was that there was no problem with Ethereum itself. There was simply an application on top of Ethereum called the DAO that was broken into and drained of some coins. I hesitate to even use the word hacked, but it was exploited by somebody who was a better programmer than the first programmer who wrote the software for this platform.
Correct. And someone actually pointed out the bug.
Yeah.
Right?
No, a professor at Cornell gave a warning. He said, we should put a hold on this. And there was actually a vote on whether to pull the plug, and the quorum for that vote was not met. And so the project just continued. And whoever the intruder was seems to have followed some of the instructions that were at that point in the public domain. So it wasn't a terrible surprise. But the sponsors of Ethereum decided that the failure of this one enterprise within their community would have serious side effects for the entire blockchain and its future. So they decided on essentially a rewind. Looks a lot like a bailout, essentially, where they walked back to the block before the intruder came and programmed all the fixes that Cornell professor had wanted in the first place, and then restarted the whole project. But people said that you had violated two important principles, that you had rewritten history on a blockchain, and you had stopped a smart contract that was executing just by pulling the plug in the middle.
Right.
And what happened very predictably is that somebody else screwed up. And there was a company called Parity Technologies about a year and a half later where a young software developer suicided a wallet. That's the verb that they use, which means that they were afraid of a bunch of coins being stolen, and so they just kind of froze it. But they froze it so well that they themselves couldn't get back into it. And so they had what was at the time way more money, and I think today is, in fact, maybe in the billions in that wallet. And the people at Parity Technologies said, don't worry, we'll go get a hard fork like the DAO did. We'll call Vitalik, we'll do the rewind. And this time Vitalik stood on principle. He said, well, why should we bail you out for your bad software? And this, of course, is what they should have said in the first iteration. I think the lesson was learned through a lot of the adverse reaction to what they'd done, that, it's a very slippery slope. And once you intervene to re-centralize the system and fix somebody's bugs, do that just one time. It's like a teacher who makes a concession on an exam, and you give credit to one student and immediately 20 other students. There's a line outside your door. So you don't do these things unless you truly have to. And I think Vitalik, showed the wisdom of a 24-year-old and was probably not thinking about the importance of values and principles, even though quite a few people at the time took great pains to point these things out. But it leads to an interesting class discussion. And, the second time it happened, the outcome was totally different. And I think they have now communicated that you better write good software, because if you don't, it's your problem. It's not the problem of the community.
So talking about good software, maybe there's a theorem that there's, it's a matter of time before you find bugs in software.
Yeah, there's something called Linus's law that you probably know better than me. But if it's public code, that eventually the crowdsourcing of the bugs will, drive them down virtually to zero. Yeah. But yeah, I think this is now being tested in this world.
No, I've found bugs in libraries and scikit-learn. You wouldn't think that, but they exist.
Oh, yeah.
Which brings me to this question about buggy contracts, right? Because Ethereum is kind of this general purpose virtual universal machine, and it sort of executes these smart contracts, but they can be buggy. So what does that do in terms of its interface with the real world?
It's a really interesting question, because these contracts are being used for everything from weather forecasting to commodities trading. There's, already plenty of real-world applications. There's going to be a lot more. But if you write a piece of code and put it out there and make it available under the MIT license for anybody to use, typically you will have disclaimed any legal liability. Now, in the law schools, there's a line of argument now that a software developer should have a fiduciary duty to the users of the code that might resemble the fiduciary duties that an attorney has to their clients, or doctors, clergymen. There are all kinds of professions that rely on essentially a duty of care where you have to not only make best efforts but deliver services of a certain professional standard. So, if you did require this of open source code, one thing you can predict easily is that fewer people would write open source code. But maybe the code that would be circulating would be of higher quality. Maybe you could more easily collect royalties if you were so inclined. But I think it's going to be interesting to see if such a regime emerges. I expect it will probably start to surface, but on an opt-in basis, that you would have some type of voluntary licensing scheme where a certain agency will, not unlike the bond rating agencies, will charge fees to do quality assurance on open source software. And you can see whether it's certified or not. A little bit like Apple with the App Store, I suppose. But this is all being improvised and innovated in real time. And certainly for the law students, this has been a gold mine because there's just a ton of problems when things go wrong. And most of them are a matter of first impression under the law, which means that the lawyers can come into court with all these arguments without really caring which side they're on. And not only is it interesting, but it's also pretty lucrative in that it's a lot of interesting work has to be done before you get to a verdict.
So would this make developers liable?
It could. And what I was saying is the developer could opt in to a liability regime.
Right.
It's a little bit like a corporate director. Many of them carry malpractice insurance, but not all of them do. And very famously, Warren Buffett doesn't permit it at Berkshire Hathaway. If you're going to be on my board, you have to take personal responsibility for your own behavior. And I could see something similar with software engineering easily happening, that you get essentially voluntary regulation in the industry that helps differentiate people based on quality.
I can imagine that this technology and smart contracts would make a lot of things very efficient, like verification, enforcement. Yeah. I guess the flip side to it is that it could lead to a pretty harsh kind of a world where your car suddenly doesn't start because you forgot to make a payment.
Exactly, yeah.
Or there was a mistake. You actually made the payment, but for some reason it wasn't deposited. All kinds of stuff happen in the real world. And it just sort of makes me wonder because on the one hand, I was thinking, the world would need fewer lawyers. Maybe that would be a good thing.
That was the original belief.
Right.
But hold on.
But it makes me wonder whether it just creates new work for lawyers of a different sort.
No, the technology you described is called a starter interruption device. And if you don't pay your auto loan on time, the car shuts off.
Right.
And I play a video clip in class in the smart contracts lecture where a car shuts off. And in fact, it's on the highway. It's under particularly dangerous circumstances. But then the lawyers get involved. And this was in Las Vegas. Nevada law has a 30-day grace period that the programmer had no idea. They shut the car off right away. And so she brings a class action lawsuit, on behalf of all Nevada car loan customers, and so forth. And I think there are many openings like this for lawyers to rein in some of the excesses of this technology. But the conclusion of this little vignette, which takes about 8 minutes in class, is, as you suggest, it leads to a harsher outcome, that there are forms of social insurance, that it's not so easy to repossess a car. These are ways of essentially subsidizing the working poor that have been provided for under the law as a polite and somewhat disguised form of consumer protection for people who have uneven income, who are struggling from month to month. And the smart contract technology, it claws back a lot of that. I think the problems of social inequality will get much worse, and the premium on good education is going to get much higher, and this really is already happening. So, the ruthlessness of the technology, it in some ways takes you back to the Taylorism, that you used to see in operations management at the turn of the 20th century, where every movement was tracked and decompose. And that didn't stand the test of time. But I think part of the reason it didn't was that we couldn't measure things quite accurately enough. And when you read now about how Amazon oversees the warehouses and how the bathroom breaks and the number of boxes lifted per hour, these things are all precisely tracked. It's because the computers and the software have gotten so much better that you can actually do this the way that Mr. Taylor would have wished to 110 years ago. And
makes me, as you were speaking, I was thinking that maybe the first kind of robo-cops we'll see are crypto cops.
Well, there are firms like Chainalysis up in Union Square that are really good at tracking down the bad people on the blockchain. Every time somebody does a huge hack against an exchange or hijacks Twitter, my first reaction is Chainalysis will catch these guys in a week. And they usually are able to track them. The question then is, can you do anything? Because if they're in Russia or some jurisdiction that is beyond the extradition treaties, we may know who they are and where the wallet is, but we're not able to get the assets back. But I think the private forensics, the crypto cops, they're already here. And they've become major subcontractors of the government. And I think these are really the skills that the government itself is going to need to internalize if it wants to stay as a relevant player in this game.
So talking about government, and I know we've been talking about regulators, why are they in the paralysis? Prior to our conversation, we were just chatting briefly about Ethereum as a currency, but what's Ripple? Why all this confusion among regulators?
I think ultimately you have to go back to the youth of the technology, that it really has been around only 13 years. And we sometimes, there's something about the stages of regulation that we tongue-in-cheek describe as denial, ignorance, ridicule, that the regulators have been progressing through all of these stages, but have reached, probably the stage where they realize this stuff is not going to collapse on its own. It really does threaten the system that's in place. It even begins to threaten the nation state itself. If you think about Google and Amazon perhaps issuing money like Alibaba and WeChat have done in China, in the future, monetary policy may be done by private media companies. And at that point, where's the regulator? Is it at, down in Washington, or is it at Amazon headquarters in Seattle? So the regulators, in many ways are under-resourced and underprepared, but I think above all, they just haven't had enough time to get their minds around this. The velocity with which this has arrived has taken a lot of people by surprise.
And it continues to progress at a tremendous speed. I mean, it almost seems like the DeFi genie is out of the bottle, right? I mean, it's just
people have been talking about it for years, but the last 12 or 18 months are when it really has exploded.
Yeah.
And just today in the mail, I got a new textbook that I ordered on DeFi because I feel somewhat urgently I need to read this over the break and maybe assign it during the spring semester because my students often know more about this than anyone in the building on the faculty.
Do you think it's unstoppable, the whole peer-to-peer finance?
Absolutely. The only way to stop this is to unplug the internet. And there are too many other benefits that we get from the World Wide Web, to do anything that drastic. But you literally would need a North Korean type solution where you just, turn off all the lights and drive people back a couple hundred years if you really wanted, not to have this going on.
So what does it mean for taxation?
Taxation is going to have to be done very differently in the future. I think we will probably shift to a value-added consumption tax and have much less reliance on an income tax going forward. This will have many winners and losers, but it's probably the only system that would be implementable by the government. I also think it will affect the size of government itself, because when you have much more difficulty printing money, borrowing money, and collecting taxes, the government just won't get the resources made available to do all the things that it's used to doing. And you're only beginning to see people come to terms with what this might mean for limiting the role of government in daily life and the role of countries competing with each other in areas like, immigration, foreign policy, and so forth, border control, public health. I think much more of this is going to be in decentralized marketplaces.
So how do you do that when you don't even know what's going on, right? There's a peer-to-peer transaction, like you don't even know it's happened, right? The only way people will tell you is voluntary disclosure.
Yeah, I think the government at this point is bluffing. And, you hear Gary Gensler saying we're going to regulate this like we regulate. He knows that can't be, so I think the first thing we need are some truth-telling regulators who say, that the game is different and we can't use the old laws in this type of a marketplace. We need to think about whether government even could be regulating this at all. And if so, what skills do we need to do that? And you're going to need a much more dynamic IT budget in government. The Internal Revenue Service, as far as I can tell, is still using 1970s systems. And, the Postal Service and the air traffic control, the upgrades are planned for 10 years and they never really happen. Government's going to have to become much more nimble, which probably means outsourcing, subcontracting much more work than they do today. And the whole footprint of government and the scale at which it operates is probably going to be much, much smaller. This is, after all, a libertarian project, and it's been much more successful than I think even the creators could ever have imagined.
One of the questions I was going to ask you earlier was, what are the limits to this kind of model of governance, this sort of consensus-based model of governance?
We really don't know. And I think, consensus is an attractive word, but what characterizes many of these things is subgroups who maybe don't agree and then split off and form their own community. We call this a fork on a blockchain. But you can almost design your own regulatory scheme by deciding what types of markets you want to participate in, which types you don't. And I think you're going to have much less uniformity and much more anarchy, for want of a better word, in the way people obtain health care and the way that they save for retirement, the way they get educated and so forth. For any one individual, that's probably going to be a good thing, but it does place a premium on education and knowledge that not everybody has the same access to, for sure.
So what do you think the future of banking is going to look like? Are they going to play a different role going forward?
Yeah, I think banks will begin to merge and consolidate as younger people stop using their services. So it'll be a little bit like electric typewriters, that you still had a big installed base in a legacy market that you could wind down for about 20 years as the word processors and so forth came in. But I think banks will gradually wither away, and you'll have only a small handful of them still doing payments and making loans of a certain type, perhaps. But I think the credit markets will migrate into what we call shadow banks, things like Quicken Loans, which is already the biggest mortgage lender. The auto companies for years have had captive car loan divisions and so forth. So I think the creation of credit will be from entities that don't have the mismatch of short-term liability and long-term assets.
Right,
so
right.
They'll have different balance sheets with long-term securities that essentially head off the bank runs. And it'll look, more like the narrow banking ideas that you heard about in the 1930s, the so-called Chicago Plan, which would essentially put an end to fractional reserve lending because of the instability that it creates. So I don't think banks will be particularly recognizable. There may be like one bank left. Kind of like in Britain, all the car companies merged into one, to make a last stand. You'll see something similar in banking. I'm sure the stock exchanges will also merge, but increasingly companies will bypass the exchanges and just issue equity tokens on blockchains. It will be gradual, though, and the businesses and the customers who are already in place will probably continue to use the old systems, and they'll gradually, lose market share, but in a gentle way.
So do you imagine like a future where individuals have an account with the Fed?
Oh, yes. I think that's, in fact, 10 years or less.
Yeah. I mean, I can imagine it would have been so much easier to with the stimulus to actually, put money in people's accounts as opposed to doing it the way we have.
There's sort of a blueprint for central bank digital currency that was first put out by the Bank of England in a group called the Future of Money team in 2013. And essentially that's what they're proposing, is that you stop using commercial banks as your payments processors and everyone just banks at the central bank. And China is already implementing this. The Chinese central bank digital currency is supposed to be launched on a broad scale in the Winter Olympics, which are just 2 months away, but it's already circulating around the country. And in the last year, this has really become a widely discussed possibility that central banks in Frankfurt, in Stockholm, in the U.S. will essentially get rid of the paper currency, issue something that looks like cryptocurrency but on a national level on some type of national blockchain. And there will be no more need for citizens to have accounts at Wells Fargo or Bank of America. We can all just have wallets on the national blockchain at the central bank. So it's a very interesting idea. The privacy risk and the risk that the government exploits its power to favor certain groups of people, I think, is quite high. But I think in the long run, this system will be almost necessary to pay negative interest rates, which are probably here to stay. And you can't really pay negative interest rates as long as there's physical currency. So retiring all the bills and banknotes is going to become, at a certain point, pretty imperative for governments.
I'm trying to wrap my head around this future where, every digital token is trackable, right? So the central bank knows exactly what you're doing, where every cent goes, along with this completely decentralized, anonymous peer-to-peer. It just seems like one is completely...
I think the choice that you'll have is to use the central bank's service or to use the service of Google. You're going to see private competitors that are running things that look a lot like central banks in their own right, but are really much bigger. Facebook has 3 billion customers, which is 10 times as many as the Federal Reserve. And so the question is not going to be, is your data out there being exploited? It's, do you want the government to be the person who has it, or do you want Google? You've already had this argument in China where the big pushback against Jack Ma and Ant Financial was their unwillingness to share consumer data with the Chinese government, which is interested acutely in social surveillance, for political control. And ultimately, Jack Ma seems to have at least partly caved in and reached some type of compromise with them. But I think what you've seen in China in the last year or so really is a preview of what will come pretty quickly to most countries in the world, where the central bank essentially usurps the role of the fractional reserve commercial banks, but at the same time, the very big retail and media companies begin creating their own payment systems that many people are probably going to prefer to using the government's payment system. Just like people would rather use WeChat and Alipay than the regular banks in China, I think Amazon and Google probably going to be preferred to the Board of Governors in Washington. It's very sobering.
Indeed.
When I first started on this, I was ridiculed by my colleagues. And I got an invitation to go to Basel. This would have been in early 2014, maybe 2015, and to meet with what was simply described as the central bank governors. And I had to read it again, but what they really wanted me to do was come meet with Janet Yellen and Mark Carney. And this was a circular room with the 40 most important central bank heads. And because I was American, they assigned Janet Yellen to be my minder for the day. And she sat next to me. She's actually a lot of fun in person. And I was taken aback by the level of knowledge in the room, that everyone there knew about Bitcoin, they understood it, and the overall emotion in the room was fear. That, pretty early on, the central bank governors around the world realized what the problems were going to be. And what we need is really a lot more people who are as as bright and have the imagination and the ability to see forward. Janet Yellen is now the Treasury Secretary and is trying to regulate crypto in a particularly aggressive way. I think she probably understands that it's not likely to work, but will maybe slow this down for a couple of years until the government can get more capacity. But I think, the role and even the existence of the central banks is up for grabs. And if they don't come up with, innovation on their own side, they are probably going to lose out to some type of crypto system that they have little control over. And monetary policy probably going to be in private hands. And that's not to say it would be done worse, because if you look at how our government finances itself and, the comedies that go on in Congress and so forth, you kind of wonder that, almost anything seems like it could be better than this.
Indeed, yeah. No, I do have some sympathy for the libertarian aspect of this new technology. There's certainly something to be said for putting power back in the hands of the people and, having less friction and all of this stuff that just weighs us down. Mm-hmm. I guess no conversation about crypto would be complete without NFTs, which are the rage these days. And part of me gets it, but part of me doesn't. I was watching this South Park episode on NFTs where this guy turns to his chief and says, "Hey, chief, I just found this duck that flies that looks like a reasonable investment opportunity." And it reminds you of sort of the .com bubble, where cab drivers were giving me investment advice.
Yeah.
And it feels like the same kind of thing.
The NFT is a property registration system. And the ones that we've heard most about are connected either to digital art or maybe some other type of collectible media. But I think in the long run, the value of this technology is probably for real estate, medical records, for creating tokens that point to valuable data in such a way that you can be very confident that this is the true data and that it hasn't been somehow altered or hacked. And if it happens to be a digital artwork, that's all well and good. And this probably is a very good registration system, not only for digital art, but even for musician royalties and other creative work like that. But the real applications of NFTs go well beyond the arts and, to very mundane things involving data in industries where the data has always been vulnerable to forgery. We have the Theranos trial going on right now, which is one of innumerable examples where there were clinical trials that were somehow not correctly reported or exaggerated and so forth. And the possibility of tokens on blockchains to force people to report this information truthfully can lead to all kinds of improvements in critical industries.
So talking about which, it surprises me that real estate is not already on the blockchain. There
are actually some nascent efforts to do this.
We still have title companies and just so much friction, right? That seems like sort of the ideal, application
Sweden
domain.
has already built out an entire national platform. And to be honest, I've lost track of how many other countries have at least begun. And there are even some municipalities and counties in the U.S. that are doing this. The problems, I think, are twofold. One is that you really do have this entrenched army of people who do title insurance and are profiting from the old system and will be able to hold it back through lobbying and political donations for a period of time. But the other problem with real estate, and this has been pointed out to me by lawyers, is that it's not homogeneous, that every piece of land has covenants, easements. Sometimes these are simply agreed to by custom in villages. In the United States, in advanced market economies, they tend to be written down, and which is why your closing takes so many hours where all these documents are passed back and forth. And I actually met the people who run the Swedish real estate blockchain, and I asked them about all this other data, the details of a property that define.
Now, is this run by a government agency or is it private?
Okay. No, it's actually run by the government real estate registration agency. We do it at the county level in the U.S., which is incredibly chaotic, but Sweden has a single unified national real estate ledger, which is wonderful. It's not a federalized country the way this is. Mm-hmm. So they, developed a platform to begin a transition to a blockchain system. And I asked them, what about these covenants that say you can't paint your house blue, or the guy has the right to cut down 3 trees a year for Christmas. Every piece of land has something like that. And they said, yeah, that's metadata, and we keep track of that in a separate database. In other words, they're still running the old system in parallel.
Right.
And, real estate lawyers have told me the same thing in this country. Good luck with that. It's not like these properties are Bitcoins. They have air rights. They have In Pennsylvania, there are mineral rights under the ground where people can tunnel under and take coal out. You study all this in law school, and you realize the diversity of real estate deeds just in the United States defies, treating them as tokens that are fungible. Each parcel is unique in its own way. And I think to accommodate that is going to be something of a challenge for blockchain technology. But I do agree that like most large-scale asset markets, the real estate market does seem ripe for disruption, and probably, there will be a role for blockchains to play, but it's being worked out.
Yeah, I suspect when it comes, it'll come quickly.
Yeah, and Sweden is very evangelical. They say we're really doing this as a model for the world, that they start talking like Ronald Coase, that if we could just fix property rights in the southern hemisphere where no countries have real estate ledgers and so nobody takes care of the land, then people could pledge it and it would be just like China where things would take off once you create property rights. And I think they have a point, but it's still kind of in the utopian stages, and you need a little more human capital infrastructure and legal infrastructure for all this to take root. So I do think it's likely to be the richer countries that need it the least that are the early adopters. Like in Australia, the state of New South Wales, it's Sydney, Australia. It's a very rich enclave, but they're looking at this, and they don't really need it. The property records are in pretty good shape there. It's not like my wife comes from Peru, which most of the land is unregistered, and same would be true in India and most of the Arab world and so forth.
I know you, like most people, are reluctant to give any kind of investment advice, but I always get people asking me, how should I think about investing in this space of crypto? How should I think about it?
I guess, there's 2 points I typically make in class. One is that it's always good advice to diversify. And this is as true in crypto as in anything else. So don't put all your eggs in one basket. But the other point that I think people don't appreciate enough is that the crypto economy is already listed on the stock exchanges, that there are not only publicly traded Bitcoin mining companies, but there's companies like JP Morgan and IBM and NVIDIA that are big suppliers or service providers to the crypto industry. And you can simply buy those stocks. I think Bank of America put out a portfolio of 43 crypto-friendly companies that were companies everyone's heard of in the legacy industries, but who have active books of business with miners, with DeFi coders, with whomever.
With real revenue.
Yeah, real revenue. And, NVIDIA makes graphics cards, and these graphics cards are used for mining crypto. NVIDIA, last I looked, was the number 5 company by market cap on the stock exchange. For a graphics card manufacturer, it's because of the demand for the crypto mining. And so if you had bought the stock in NVIDIA, it's had a trajectory pretty similar to Tesla. And Tesla talks about Dogecoin, that kind of stuff. But NVIDIA is actually a supplier to the industry.
It's funny you bring up NVIDIA because I teach the systematic investing class. And in 2017, I said, if I were you, I'd just buy tech and especially NVIDIA.
There you go.
But for different reasons. My thinking was that they're going to be sort of the leaders in the AI space. Their gaming tech, the chips were just well suited for deep learning. And we had this Future of AI conference here in 2016 where Jensen came and spoke. And I remember looking at that stock price and it was $30. And I said, I really should buy a ton of this. And I said, well, I'll wait for a pullback. And then it was 70 and 100 or whatever. And I was like, all right, I'm just getting in and staying. I just decided to get in and stay in. But it's one of those things where I got in for the wrong reasons. I thought it was going to be AI, whereas it's actually crypto. But now actually I'm even more bullish on NVIDIA because I feel like they're going to clean up in the metaverse. They seem to be very well positioned for that.
Yeah, we're planning next semester to hold one class meeting in the metaverse. Get a lecture hall, rent it out, have the students, attend class virtually. We'll see how this goes.
Well, David, this has been fascinating, a lot of fun, and I've really enjoyed it. Thanks so much.
Thank you for the invitation, Vasant. I think, we can play this 6 months from now. We'll probably be right about 2/3 of what we said.
That would be optimistic.
Yeah.
It's when it comes to tech, I always tell people it's hard to know what the world's going to look like 2 years from now.
Yeah.
Let alone 5 or 10 years from now. And I have a similar regret that I'm not going to live to see the metaverse in its full glory. I think what's coming down the line is just going to be mind-boggling.
Yeah, it's a very exciting time, and it's been fortunate to be at a business school that has really embraced this. And you come into every day and you have colleagues working in this area and students keenly interested in many of the most important players right at our doorstep in New York. So it's really been, for me, a second career, a totally new subject area that is absolutely fascinating.
Awesome. Well, David, thanks so much again. It's been a pleasure.
All right. Thank you, Vasant.